And Michael will. Good. I should go boy, girl, boy, girl. You do blank? Okay, I'll put it.
Is this snored? I thought
No.
you're old, you fall off the platform. You know, have you noticed? If Karen and you weren't there, I just drove off.
Phone's always
When
a
I
good thing
turned
to do.
75, drove off. That's what we were saying with Nancy. Okay, here comes the boss.
So we've got black over here. Oh, yes.
We like black.
Alors, bonjour et bienvenue. My name is Erwin Kotler. I'm the chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, Centre Raoul Wallenberg pour les droits de la personne, named in remembrance of and in honor of our first honorary citizen, Raoul Wallenberg, who showed how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. I'm delighted we can be here today to discuss issues of concern not only to our Raoul Wallenberg All-Party Parliamentary Caucus on Human Rights, but I believe to the people of Canada and beyond. And the four issues that we're going to be addressing today, and we've got a repository of experience and expertise with our fellow parliamentarians here, and also Professor Errol Mendes, President of the International Commission of Jurists. And the topics we're going to be discussing in the order will be, number one, International Political Prisoner Advocacy Project. We launched this at the beginning of this parliamentary session, but what we're announcing today as a new initiative is a political prisoner advocacy project that will be organized by, anchored in, and represented by parliamentarians themselves, who will adopt, respectively, political prisoners. And we'll begin at this point with Mary Lou Mcfadden, who's adopting political prisoner Nasrin Sotoudeh. And this is an extremely dramatic case study of the role and importance of parliamentarians. When I was an MP, some now 8 years ago, we had then an Iranian political prisoner advocacy project. We adopted then the case and cause of Nasrin Sotoudeh, the iconic women's rights advocate in Iran, through advocacy by parliamentarians at the time, and one of them is Senator Renel Andrzejczyk here. We succeeded, not only us, but those working in concert with her, to bring about the release of Nasrin Sotoudeh. Regrettably, she has been rearrested this summer as part of the largest wave of arrest and imprisonment in Iran that we have seen in years, where the leadership of every civil society group in Iran have been arrested, whether we talk about women or we talk about environmentalists or teachers or trade union workers or lawyers and the like. So that's the background, and I'll start with Mary Lou Mcfadden, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, go ahead.
Merci, Owen. Je suis ici pour attirer l'attention sur Nasrin Sotoudeh, encore, et la situation des prisonniers détenus et également pour la défense des droits de la personne. Nasrin Sotoudeh is a wife and mother of 2 children. She is a top-rated lawyer and a well-respected author. She is a woman who has put the rights of others ahead of her own. Nasrin is also, again, a political prisoner. Iranian Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi, a former client of Nasrin, says, Nasrin is fearless in taking on the tough cases that other lawyers carefully avoid. Nasreen has been unlawfully imprisoned by Iranian officials 4 times since 2010. In June of this year, she was sentenced to a 5 years in prison sentence after being convicted in absentia. So far, the world has hardly noticed. Through her skills as both a lawyer and a writer, she has worked tirelessly to protect the rights of women and children in Iran. She has been unwavering in her defense of justice, sacrificing her own well-being. The prosecution and unlawful detention of human rights defenders like Nasreen Sotoudeh is an abhorrent abuse of power. It is our obligation as privileged parliamentarians to hold this unchecked power to account. This is why the work done by the International Political Prisoner Advocacy Project we're launching here today with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights is invaluable. As global citizens, we must work together to ensure that the criminalization of human rights defenders is no longer tolerated. Words are not enough, but we can speak out when human rights defenders like Nasreen Sotoudeh have been silenced illegally. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you, Senator, and I trust that your advocacy will help bring about the liberation of Nasreen Sotoudeh, as we hope this engagement of parliamentarians will do on behalf of each of the political prisoners adopted by our parliamentarians. And in this, I would like to ask Anita Vanderbilt to come forward, who will speak about parliamentarians working on behalf of other imprisoned parliamentarians. Anita.
Yes, thank you very much, and bienvenue. I'm here today also to support the Advocacy Project for Political Prisoners. It is vitally important as members of Parliament that when we see other legislators, when we see other elected members of Parliament around the world targeted specifically because of their politics and because of their defense of human rights, in particular when they are women human rights defenders, that parliamentarians in other countries stand up and speak out. Very often, in many of these human rights violating regimes, they use test cases. They will pick somebody and arrest and then see if the international community takes note. And if there is silence, then they believe that they can continue and do more, and they have license to do more. And so it is very important. We don't always realize as parliamentarians what an incredible voice and megaphone that we have on the world stage. But a 1-minute statement in the House of Commons can be heard and reverberate around the world because it means that it's being noticed. In my case, I am taking up the cause of Leila de Lima. She is a senator in the Philippines, and she's been in prison since February of 2016 because she's been speaking out regarding the abuses and the extrajudicial killings that are happening in that country. She is the former chair of the Human Rights Commission in the Philippines, and she is in prison solely because she is a human rights defender. So as a parliamentarian, as a woman who is a parliamentarian, I believe we need to reach out globally and speak out for other women human rights defenders and parliamentarians who are imprisoned wrongfully because they're speaking out for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. And I mentioned at the outset that we've seen an almost unprecedented wave of repression in Iran where all leaders of civil society there have been arrested and imprisoned. I'll ask Michael Levitt, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to speak to that issue.
Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Kotler, Earl Mendez, and colleagues in both houses. It's been a difficult year, a year when repression in Iran has increased vastly. We see greater numbers of torture, arbitrary arrest, killing, and this is something which must not be silent. I want to add my voice to the Political Prisoners Advocacy Project mentioned here today and the importance of calling out and making sure that the world does not forget names like Miriam Mombeni, Raif Badawi, Leopoldo Lopez, and the Baha'i leadership in Iran. The Iranian regime is not just maintaining its human rights violations, but doubling down on them. Persecution of the Baha'i and LGBTQ minorities, the continued arrest and detention of political prisoners, widespread arbitrary arrest, torture, and execution, and other oppressive acts by this despotic regime. They are exporting this disdain for fundamental human rights as a destabilizing influence across the region, through the Iranian proxy and terrorist groups Hezbollah and Hamas, through the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which is contributing to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, through the regime's continued threats and incitement against the State of Israel, and through its wholesale support and export of terror, which again knows no bounds. I was proud to join the Prime Minister and government in the House in voting to condemn the current regime of Iran for its ongoing sponsorship of terrorism around the world, and that we stand with the Iranian people and recognize that they, like all people, have a fundamental right to freedom and liberty. The regime must continue to be held to account for these violations. Canada will once again introduce its annual resolution at the UN holding Iran accountable for its human rights violations. We continue to uphold strict sanctions against Iran. We continue to uphold the Justice for Victims of Terror Act. And we should continue to look at opportunities and other tools like Canada's Magnitsky Act to further the voice of those around the world that say we will not stay silent as repression continues to grow in this despotic regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. You will have received, I believe, a summary in a foreword that I wrote to the monograph on architects of repression of all the various civil society groups that have been arrested and imprisoned, dovetailing with Michael has said, and we are going to identify the major human rights violators in Iran who are to be targeted and sanctioned under global justice for Sergei Magnitsky sanctions. I'll now ask Len Laverdiere, who's been engaged in the issue with respect to Saudi Arabia and the matters of human rights in Saudi Arabia, most recently dramatized in the brutal murder of Khashoggi, to speak to these issues. Hélène.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Cutler. Merci beaucoup. Merci à tous d'être ici aujourd'hui pour entendre notre appel renouvelé, notre appel multipartisan à un respect fondamental des droits de la personne à travers le monde. Mes collègues ont parlé de l'Iran. Quand on regarde l'Arabie saoudite, on n'est pas plus optimiste, je crois. On a tous vu l'horrible meurtre de Jamal Khashoggi à Istanbul et je crois que pour plusieurs, ça a été un peu la goutte qui a fait déborder le vase. Ça a créé un outrage à travers le monde, un outrage qui est bien mérité, je crois. Mais je pense qu'en même temps, quand on regarde ce cas terrible, il ne faut pas oublier non plus les Yéménites qui meurent chez eux ou qui sont affamés. Il ne faut pas oublier les minorités religieuses en Arabie saoudite qui souffrent une répression importante. Et évidemment, il ne faut pas oublier Raif Badawi. Ça fait des années maintenant que Raif Badawi est en prison. Sa famille est ici. J'ai eu le plaisir encore de rencontrer sa femme et ses enfants la semaine dernière. Et je crois que, in the case of Raif Badawi, now is the time to act. I mean, this has been going on for too long. And so I'm really proud to adopt Raif Badawi in part as part of this great initiatives of parliamentarians adopting people who are suffering often just for speaking their minds, as Raif did. So, c'est une initiative qui me semble tout à fait louable d'adopter des prisonniers politiques et je vais me permettre aussi auprès de certains de mes collègues de faire, de promouvoir l'adoption. Et Raif Badawi, certainement, mais tant d'autres. Saïd Malikpour en Iran, ma collègue Anita a mentionné Leila de Lima aux Philippines. Il y a tellement de dossiers sur lesquels on peut s'unir, les parlementaires, pour pousser et faire libérer ces gens. Merci beaucoup.
Et merci, Hélène, pour adopter le prisonnier politique Raif Badawi et aussi pour mentionner Saïd Malikpour parce qu'il a une connexion canadienne à l'égard de ces deux prisonniers. We have a particular Canadian connection. Raif Badawi, as we know, his wife and 3 children are now Canadian citizens, while he continues to languish now in his 6th year of imprisonment for saying 6 years ago what the Crown Prince has been saying himself about seeking a more open Saudi Arabia, a more moderate Islam. And where Saeed Malikpour is now in his beginning 11th year of imprisonment, having been initially arrested, tortured, and in that case, he was a permanent resident of Canada on the way to Canadian citizenship. So we have this clear Canadian connection. We have spoken here about the issue of Magnitsky sanctions as one way of approaching the political prisoners and sanctioning their violators. I just want to say that we are meeting today at a time when there has been an assault on freedom of the press and on the safety of journalists that has been unparalleled since the advent of the 21st century. The Khashoggi case and cause has dramatized the pain and plight of journalists, of freedom of the press, of the safety of journalists. But Khashoggi is one of a number of cases. Even Saudi Arabia, there are 18 other imprisoned journalists. And lest one think that Turkey is an innocent interlocutor with regard to Khashoggi, it should be appreciated that Turkey has jailed more journalists than any other country in the world. And so if we want to address the Khashoggi murder, what we need at this point is not an investigation that can be done either by Saudi Arabia or by Turkey, but we need an independent, international, transparent, investigative inquiry conducted under the auspices of a UN agency headed by a distinguished jurist and group of investigators so that we can get at the truth. And we need to begin, and here Saudi Arabia must begin by providing the body of Khashoggi and returning it to the family who are suffering in the absence of not even being able to give Khashoggi a proper burial in accordance with Islamic law and in accordance with the obligations of Saudi Arabia under Islamic law in that regard. So I'll turn it over now, as we've been speaking about Magnitsky sanctions, to Professor Errol Mendes and then to Senator Andrzejczyk, both of whom, one from a scholarly point of view, the other as a senator, have been so deeply engaged in the issue of the application of Magnitsky sanctions. Errol?
Merci, Owen, pour cette invitation et pour joindre ses collègues très, très distingués. Et merci pour tous et toutes d'être ici. I'm Errol Mendes. I'm the president of the International Commission of Jurists Canada, and our focus is very much on how to promote the rule of law and human rights through law around the world and to protect human rights champions and journalists around the world. And as Owen said, the position that we now face ourselves and all Western countries who believe in human rights and democracy face with how to deal with the situation that has happened with the killing of Khashoggi. Now, for all the reasons that Owen has mentioned, there is still a huge, outstanding accountability challenge that the world, Canada, and any country who believes in human rights and the rule of law must face. And for all the reasons that, again, Owen mentioned in terms of the failure to produce the body, the failure to have any sense of accountability, the views that Saudi Arabia will say we can handle it ourselves, what sort of trial could that possibly be if the trial was taken in Saudi Arabia, or for that matter, even in Turkey? And for that reason, I do support the establishment of an international mechanism to adjudicate on what happened and to promote certain types of accountability mechanisms for those who committed this horrible crime. Because, as Owen has mentioned, there was a Globe and Mail article just a few days ago which showed that 1 in 10 journalists are murdered or killed without any repercussion. So if Canada really believes that this is one of the most fundamental supports for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, we have to start thinking about how do we work with our allies in the West and other parts of the world. Right now, we have the Magnitsky Act passed by the United States in 2012. Britain passed it this year. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and I've forgotten the third one, Latvia, have passed the Magnitsky Act. Today, the Parliament, the government of the Netherlands is organizing an event to look at a EU-wide Magnitsky Act, which could potentially be part of this mechanism to hold Saudi Arabia accountability. Canada has to start thinking about how we can use that act to start the process, not the end, but to start the process of seeking accountability for the gross dismemberment, killing and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. What would that entail? Well, under the Magnitsky Act, it allows for governments, and we should do it in cooperation with our allies in Europe, to basically come up with targeted sanctions such as travel freezes, business and asset freezes, refusing to do business with key players which have been involved in that type of dismemberment and killing. Now, that will not end the accountability challenge, but it's a start. And even if those individuals involved in the Khashoggi killing do not travel to Canada, do not have assets in Canada, what it does, it sends a very powerful signal to those countries who think about doing the same thing to journalists, that there will be a huge stigma and reputational hit to them, which could outlast far beyond what they may think they have gained by the killing, the torture, or in the case of Raif Badawi, by holding him up and not allowing him to essentially do the most basic of freedom of expression by having a blog in Saudi Arabia. And the fact that his wife is here in Canada means, again, we should expand our decision to force these countries to think about there will be accountability mechanisms if they keep on doing this. So my recommendation to this committee is to think about this in that larger scope. How do we start ratcheting up the accountability mechanisms, especially for journalists? Because right now they are the number one target for all the authoritarian dictatorships around the world, because they know they cannot survive if they allow these individuals to practice their freedom to promote truth to power. And with that, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And I'll call on the architect of Magnitsky Sanctions in the Senate, Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Erwin. I'm here to lend my voice to particularly the Nelson Mandela International Political Prisoners Advocacy Project. This is a second phase. Erwin and I were involved in the first phase, and what I think we need in Canada are more tools to deal with the issues of abuses of human rights around the world and, in fact, within our own country. And therefore, I was very pleased to be with Erwin when we worked on the International Criminal Court. That was one tool, a multilateral tool that is very important, and Canada must continue to support the ICC. The Advocacy Project had limited success the first time around. Nazreen was released. I worked on that. But unfortunately, the world has not changed sufficiently, and we're back with this project. I think we have to work state by state, so Canada has an obligation to address these human rights abuses. I think we have to work individuals to individuals, and that's what the Magnitsky Bill is about. It is about getting at the actual perpetrators of any human rights abuses, whether they are at a local level, whether they are at a higher level. It is your personal conscience that has to address these individual issues. So the Magnitsky Act, which was introduced by myself in the Senate and adopted unanimously in the Senate and then the House of Commons, calls upon our government to implement sanctions against individuals who are perpetrators of human rights. I believe that we have to, as a parliament, continue to reach Canadians and get them to understand that we have these tools, that we need more tools, and our obligation is continue to fight against these abuses, whether they are in Iran, whether they are in Yemen, whether they are in Saudi Arabia, or in any other country in the world. The real reason we need these tools is that we do get international press on certain cases, but there are as many political prisoners, as many journalists in custody in countries around the world that we don't even know their names. So I'm pleased that we continue to reach for tools and answers, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator. And I just want to, I think before I say anything by way of close, I'll ask if there's any questions that anybody wants to put.
Hi, it's Mike Blanchfield, Canadian
Yes,
Press.
Mike.
What do you think of the actions of the White House towards the media in the last 24 hours?
The actions of?
The White House towards the media in the last 24 hours?
Well, I think what has been happening in the last 24 hours has been reflecting a pattern that has been going on, regrettably, for some time now. I think it's yet another example of why we have to concern ourselves with the importance of freedom of the press globally, in particular in authoritarian regimes, because of the consequences, as we have seen in authoritarian regimes, but also because it is so central to democracies that we have to ensure that we promote and protect it within democracies itself. And that is why I say that if there's one thing about this press conference that is crucial, is that we have to realize that we are witnessing an unprecedented assault on freedom of the press, and we are witnessing an unprecedented danger to the lives of journalists, has been described here today. And so I'll see if we have quickly, if one more question maybe, or yeah.
From Ukraine. I have a question. You didn't mention Russia in your report. So I have lots of political prisoners there. So will you be able to help those people that are jailed in Russia?
Yeah, let me just answer because of time quickly. We didn't mention a number of countries because we were highlighting what we could. But if you look at our list of political prisoners, one of the political prisoners that we are representing, not the only one, is Pichugin, who's the longest-lasting longest-serving political prisoner in Russia. He is one of the cases that we have taken up. I've written on his case and cause. And as you mentioned, Russia, I'll close by saying this. And 45 years ago, when I was involved in the defense of political prisoners in the former Soviet Union, I used to say that vacation time in the West was prison time in the Soviet Union. That's when the Soviet Union would arrest and imprison its dissidents and the like, because they knew the countries were on vacation, parliaments were adjourned and the like. At least, however, an outcry developed and political prisoners were released, whether they be Sakharov or Sharansky and the like. We had this wave of repression this summer. We've seen it in Iran in particular. We've seen it in Saudi Arabia. We've seen it in Turkey. And it's been greeted by silence, indifference, and inaction on behalf of the international community. We're hoping, therefore, that parliamentarians can take the lead through the International Political Prisoner Advocacy Project, which, interestingly enough, and with this I close, we call it the Nelson Mandela Political Prisoner Advocacy Project, in remembrance of the person, Nelson Mandela, who endured 27 years in a South African prison and emerged to not only preside over dismantling of apartheid, but become the first president of the first democratic, non-racial, free South Africa. Tells you something about the importance of freeing political prisoners. And later this afternoon, we are launching Mandela Week in Canada with the arrival of Justice Masaneki from South Africa, former Deputy President of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, himself a cellmate of Nelson Mandela. He will be hosted by our Canadian Supreme Court tomorrow. He will be inaugurating the first Nelson Mandela Lectureship in Human Rights on Monday at 4 p.m. at the Monk Centre in the University of Toronto. And we hope that is this kind of involvement, of consciousness raising and mobilization with parliamentarians at the forefront that will lead to the freeing of the Mandelas of our day and the transformation of authoritarian societies into democratic ones. Thank you.
If I can just add very quickly, actually, the first Magnitsky sanctions that were brought forward were Russia, South Sudan, and Venezuela. So there's actually a number of officials that have already been subject to Canadian Magnitsky sanctions.
I want to recognize Anthony Housefather, Chair of the Justice Committee, who had other obligations and kind enough to make it here and join us. Thank you, Anthony. And thank you all for being with us. Yeah. No, you touched on all the issues involved in sanctions.
Fantastic.
I knew that